So Hannah, thank you for joining us, even though I'm technically joining you right now.
I know. I think I just took over Health Ed's. I think I just took over your event by accident.
It's okay. So to begin with, so we are teaming up, Health Ed and SAFE. We're teaming up to talk about consent for Sex Ed for All month. So do you want to give us like a little introduction about SAFE services and who you are?
Yes. Okay. First, I just want to say I don't know I can't see any. I don't think I'll be able to see any comments. Like mine is buffering, so I
Okay,
just want to say if you probably will have to read comments if there are any comments.
I can do that.
Okay. So hello. My name is Hannah. I am an advocate educator here with the SAFE program, that is Services to Aid Families. We are OCO's Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Response Program. If you can put the
Yep,
like
I put it up
disclaimer
there.
thing in the comments, thank you. And sorry, I'm just getting this set up. And
Sure.
I was here as a guest with health education, but we had some technical difficulties, which is why we are starting now at 3:24. But we are the county's domestic violence and rape crisis provider program. So we do a lot of things. We have a shelter that we run, but then we also do education things such as an event like this. Myself being an advocate and an educator, I do direct intervention services, so working directly with clients, but then also doing prevention education on domestic violence, and then also healthy relationships and consent, like what we're going to talk about today. Probably the most important thing to note about our services is that we do have a 24/7 crisis hotline that goes on nights, weekends, and holidays, and I think Kenzie is going to put it in the comments, but that is
Yep.
315-342-1600. And that's the best way to access any of our services. So if anything we talk about today, if you are curious and learning more about our services, that is the way to get in contact with me or any of the other advocates, anyone in this program. And then we did just want to put a trigger warning that today's topic, consent, is going to be pretty light, but we might talk a little bit about instances of sexual assault. So do what anyone has to do to keep yourself safe, be aware of your surroundings, all of that.
And I am going to try to put the video up if it allows us to. Who knows with all the complications, but it should be available to people if they want to come back to it later as well and go through it in their own time instead of watching live.
Perfect.
So I guess we should begin right at the very beginning. And how would you define consent? What does that mean?
Well, if I'm talking to somebody and it's the first time they've ever heard the word consent, the easiest way to define consent is basically giving somebody permission. So when we talk about consent, sometimes it can seem like this huge kind of scary topic, or when people think of consent, they often associate that word with maybe assault or something like that. But when it comes down to it, consent is giving someone permission to do something. And in the context of how we're going to talk about consent today, which is going to be consent when it comes to intimate relationships or when it comes to sex or things of that nature, consent also is something we practice every day. When somebody says to you, do you want fries with that? They're asking your permission. Maybe that's not the best example, but I just think
Or can I have some of your fries?
yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the definitions that we use when we're talking about consent is we say that consent is clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing. So, and I'm reading this like right from the presentation that we use when we're educating on consent, whether it be in the community or educating students. So when we say consent is clear, we mean that everybody who's involved knows exactly what's going on, that there is mutual understanding. And traditionally, some people might be used to the no means no model of consent, but what we know now is that we're really shifting toward this yes means yes model, because the absence of no is not a yes. So it's not that somebody needs to say no for something not to happen, it's that somebody needs to say yes for something to happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Consent is coherent, so people who are incapacitated by alcohol or other drugs cannot consent. Somebody needs to know the who, what, where, when, and why of what's going on. So if somebody has consumed so much alcohol that they are falling down, that they don't really know what's going on, that their speech is slurred, that they can't make decisions for themselves, that person is not coherent enough. That person cannot consent. And of course, people who are passed out or unconscious or asleep in any way, they can't consent. Consent is willing, so it's never given under pressure. We use the C word, coercion, and the best way to define coercion just means kind of convincing somebody to do something. So if someone only consents after they've been begged, like, come on, do it, just do it, it'll be fun, you know, you came over here, it's so late, you said you wanted to earlier, and then they eventually say yes, that's not willing consent. We don't have consent.
I would say like any type of pressure, and like that could be like a huge array of different reasons you feel that pressure, but in order for it to be consensual, I'd say it's a complete lack of pressure on any.
Yep, you're doing something totally of your own volition because you want to. And of course that ties in with, I think we'll talk about it a little bit later, but power dynamics, things like that. So if somebody is your boss, if somebody is your teacher, if somebody has any kind of power over you, you're not on equal footing. That person cannot give consent. And then also consent is ongoing. So it must be granted every time an interaction happens between two people, and also has to happen at every step
of the line.
Of the line. Yeah, exactly. So if you are on a date with somebody, they should be getting consent to kiss you. That doesn't mean that you're also consenting for things to go further than that. Consent needs to be given at every step. So clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing.
Awesome. So maybe before I ask this question, I should give a little bit of background about Sex Ed for All Month. So this is the third year that Sex Ed for All Month has been like a thing. In previous years, May has always been teen pregnancy prevention, and that definitely is important to provide people with the education and the resources to decide when they want to be parents. But we realize it is so much more than that. You know, sex education is learning about consent, obviously. It's about learning about condoms and birth control and STIs, and like the topics are endless, honestly, in sex education, or at least they should be, in order for someone to make those decisions for themselves, including when they would like to become a parent, if they would even like to become a parent. So we've really expanded it, and we're giving it more inclusive so it applies to everybody, because when we think teen pregnancy prevention, a lot of times there's entire groups of people that get left out of that. The LGBTQ community may not feel that they all belong in that, because reproduction is not really something in their realm for everyone in that community. And sometimes guys, boys, males, people with a penis also feel like it doesn't apply to them either. People might think that's the concern of the person with the uterus, and that's just not true. Sex education should be for everyone, so we can all like make those decisions for ourselves on a personal level, and then also create a culture where like we know about these things, we can take the stigma out of them, we can make sure that everybody's thriving and living their best life. So all that being said, what do you think the role of consent is when we talk about sex ed for all?
Well, I think it's exactly what you said. I think we're at this place, especially in the year 2021, where all of us who work in this field, we need to move toward being more inclusive. And exactly what you said, that includes things like including the LGBTQ plus community in a way that's very, very specific, like creating specific efforts to be inclusive. And we can see that in our language, and we can see that in the ways that even here at SAFE, the changes that we've made to toward these efforts to be more inclusive. And I think that in the past, when we think about sex education, sometimes we do have this narrow kind of thinking. We think of the guest speaker who comes into your health class and is teaching you how to put a condom on a banana and is showing you the scary STI slideshow that's usually inaccurate and usually just about fear mongering, which isn't the best way to prevent or educate. So we need to realize that sex education really begins with consent. We really can't have a conversation about sex without talking about consent and having these really honest conversations, and also realizing that while consent is something that everybody does practice in our everyday lives, it is also something to be taught and a skill to be learned. And that has to do with conversations like this and how, we can talk about consent, but really like what does consent look like, and kind of bridging the gap between the work that each of us do.
Yeah. Consent definitely should be a part of sex ed. And one thing I was thinking about when you were talking, and I haven't, really brought up before, is sex ed for all also covers all different ages too, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more later for sure. But both sex ed and consent are things that those are conversations we really should start talking about like at the beginning of our lives, because it applies, and it helps us thrive in other ways, not just as far as like pregnancy prevention goes. Like, you need that information before you even get to a reproductive age.
Exactly.
For all sorts of things, all different reasons. So.
Exactly. And that's the kind of ties in with harm reduction, and all of that is teaching consent, teaching about healthy relationships from a young age, so that it's kind of this you learn as you go and you build upon knowledge, so that when adolescents do get to that age, that it's not them being hit with this all at once and it's all brand new information. It's building upon what they've learned throughout the years.
Yeah, because it seems silly in ways, but it truly is a skill. So it's easier to just continue to build upon that skill. Like, I already kind of had these skills when I addressed, if someone wanted to take my fries, can I have your fries? Well, I already know how to respond to that, or like different ways to do that. So yeah.
Yeah.
So Speaking of fries, do you want to tell us a little bit about the fries model and what informed consent and all of that means?
Yeah, so another one of the models that we use when we educate is the FRIES model of consent. FRIES stands for freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And I think I saw that the health education page actually shared a graphic that explains the FRIES model, so definitely use that as a reference. This is one of my favorite models to use because I think it's so easy to remember and understand, and who doesn't love fries?
Yeah.
So, and it definitely ties in with that other definition of consent being clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing. It's just kind of a different way to say it. So we know that consent is freely given. So again, there's no pressure being had on one person to say yes. It's that they're saying yes of their own volition, their own free will. Consent is reversible, so you can stop what's happening at any time. You can say yes to one thing and then say no to the next thing. You can say yes to something on a Monday, and then by the time Thursday comes around, you need consent again. And that doesn't mean that you then owe that person something, or that saying yes once is saying yes every time. You need to get consent every time.
Mm-hmm.
Consent is informed, and I'm going to come back to informed because that's what we're going to talk about right now. Consent is enthusiastic, so everybody wants to be doing what's happening, and everyone is excited and equally into it.
Yeah, like free of that coercion that we talked about.
Yep, exactly. And consent is specific, so that kind of goes with the reversible thing that I was talking about, where a person is giving and getting consent for each specific act that's happening. So again, saying, like, do you want to kiss? Yeah. Do you want to do X, Y, and Z? I don't know if I want to do that. That would be a no, and that's okay, and that's fine. So to come back to that informed piece, when we think of informed consent, for example, if you were to Google informed consent, a lot of the times we think about this in terms of healthcare. That's a phrase that comes up and has to do with like patient-informed care and all of that. But when we talk about informed consent, and part of what informed consent means within the FRIES model is that every party who's engaging in this all knows what's going on, and they all have all the information needed to make an informed decision. So part of what this involves is, for example, if two people agree to use a condom, they've both decided that they're both consenting to this and to using a condom. If that person removes the condom halfway through what's happening, and does not tell the person that they're having sex with, we no longer have informed consent. That person was not a part of that decision making. That's not a consensual situation. This is a form of sexual assault. It's called stealthing. And that's one example of where informed consent plays a part. Something else that this has to do with that's super important and super relevant is STI status and STI disclosure. So this is a part of informed consent. If a person is positive for an STI, that is something that they need to be informing their partner of before any kind of interaction takes place between the two of them.
We have posted a few things on that, but just to give a few tips if I could. Yeah, you definitely want to have that conversation before it ever even gets to a sexual point. And it can be awkward, but if we really work on normalizing these things and taking the stigma out of that, it will be a much easier conversation to have. So you want to have it beforehand and make sure, whatever way works best for you, make sure that you feel safe to disclose to that person. If for some people, they feel comfortable doing it face to face. Other people, they might need like a mutual ground, like not at that person's house, but you know, wherever they feel safest. And if you really have to, I mean, on the phone is okay too. So, yeah, as
Yeah.
far as tips for disclosing, anyways.
Yeah, and that kind of a conversation is also a skill that can be learned, and also ties in with maybe something that's not talked about a lot, but certainly with campaigns like Sex Ed for All, we want to be normalizing these conversations, exactly what you said. And I really want to reiterate and emphasize what you said about safety. It's important to note that it is not always safe for people to disclose their STI status. And there are a lot of reasons, valid reasons, why a person may not disclose. We, of course, know that there are circumstances where somebody has been assaulted. And, of course, in that situation, no responsibility is on that person to have disclosed in that circumstance, of course. And also, if somebody is fearful of retaliation, if they were to disclose, we just want to remember and keep that in the back of our minds, trying not to pass judgment, because like I said, there are many valid reasons why disclosure may not be possible due to lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we want to remember that it is best practice to disclose your STI status before engaging in sex with somebody, because that way you're allowing that person to have all the facts and make an informed decision. We want to have informed consent every single time.
Yeah. And most likely that conversation is going to bring forth even more conversation, because maybe they need more education about that. Not everyone knows all about every STI. And some of that education could also be like, what are our steps going forward? Just because you disclose to someone that you have an STI does not automatically mean that they don't want to have sex with you still. You know, there are different ways around that, I guess you could say. Using a condom is very effective, especially when used properly, at preventing the transmission of STIs. And there's also medication out there now, like PrEP, which is something that someone would take if, say, you can take it for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is if you are in a sexual relationship with someone who is HIV positive, taking PrEP every day can prevent that transmission from happening. So you're still able to have, you know, sex with each other. Or maybe, you know, someone is HIV positive and they've been on medication for a really long time, and they're to the point where maybe their viral load is, you know, undetectable. So you really can't transmit it. So it really is a lot of a conversation. Or like with HPV, for instance, there is a vaccine out there, the Gardasil vaccine, and it prevents against several different types, several different strains of HPV that cause, you know, cancers, especially including cervical cancer, I think is one that you hear the most about, but of many different areas where you could be having sex, your throat, penis, anus, your vulva, any of those areas. So that there are steps out there that you can take. You can always come to us at Health Education to get some of that education, or to find out, you know, this is what me and my partner are dealing with. What are some steps that we can take to like prevent that from being an issue? So it doesn't have to be so scary to disclose that to somebody, disclose your status to somebody, because there are options. So yeah.
Exactly.
So I wanted to ask you, working with SAFE, what are some very common misconceptions and misrepresentations you see in regards to consent?
So a lot of the times when I think of misrepresentation or representation, I think of what we see in the media, because of course our conversation up until this point has been about kind of interpersonal interactions between two people, but of course we don't exist in a bubble. We have a lot of messages that come at us from a lot of different places. We have our friends as influences, we have our parents, we have our upbringing, we have our educators, we have our teachers, and then we also have the media, and we have pop culture. So when I think of the ways that consent has been traditionally portrayed in the media, I honestly think of really negative portrayals and really misrepresentation.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I feel like whenever I see like sexual intercourse happening on TV shows and movies, you never see consent. Like, it's never really talked about. You just see them doing it. Like,
Yep. Yes, it's like this just magically both people know exactly what they want, and they there's no talking and there's no awkwardness. It's extremely unrealistic. Unrealistic at best, and straight up non-consensual at worst. You know, there have definitely been portrayals that have, maybe not when we're talking necessarily about consent and sex, but I can think of when we think about like healthy relationships, shows or movies like Twilight have actually very negative portrayals and actually romanticize really unhealthy behaviors. And I don't know, we didn't talk about this the other day, but it makes me think of the documentary, I think it's called Undisclosed.
I feel like I've seen that.
It's the one that's about representation and misrepresentation of trans people in the media. And although that documentary focuses on
Disclosure, the one on Netflix.
Yes, Disclosure. Yeah. Although that focuses mainly on the experiences of trans people and how they are represented, I think it also has like amazing conversations in it about consent and about the ways that sex and relationships are portrayed in the media that's relatable not only for trans people but for anyone. So I'd say that's a really good resource to use if anyone is interested in learning more about representation in the media. But I think part of like Sex Ed for All, our shift toward making real efforts toward being more inclusive and toward looking at how the media affects us, I think we are shifting in a really positive way towards showing realistic and positive representation.
One more thing I wanted to say about that, like on the flip side, when there is like a lack of consent in like a movie or on TV or whatever, it feels like it's more malicious than it always can be sometimes. Like, everyone thinks like it doesn't even always have to be like a sexual assault, just the lack of consent. Sometimes it can be violent, or like someone is physically forcing themselves, but that's not always what that looks like. Like, we talked about coercion, and like sometimes it's just a pressure, and it doesn't have to be so physical, you know?
Exactly.
It could be like an imbalance there, a power imbalance, or even just like a word or a look. It doesn't have to be physical.
Exactly. I was just going to say, I think one show that comes to mind is Law and Order Svu, and I'll admit I used to watch this show all the time. Sometimes I still do. There's nothing wrong with consuming this kind of media as long as we are critical consumers. And when we look at shows like that and similar crime shows, sometimes it'll show sexual assault is the serial rapist who jumps out of the bushes and is a stranger, and it's this super physically violent offense, and the bad guy usually gets caught, and it's like this whole thing. But what we know And the sad reality is that when a person is assaulted, it is most likely at the hands of somebody that they know. So we can see then where this miseducation comes in, and then somebody who might have this happen to them, that can be very confusing for them, because if that's not what they're taught that assault looks like, or if that's not what they're taught that how consent should work, then that can be confusing when this happens to them, because that can make them question, well, what did just happen to me?
Yeah.
So we can see how representation matters.
I think, you know, even like when it came to like the Me Too movement and stuff, at first it was like, I mean, some of that had to do with like power dynamics and stuff and things that felt more obvious. But like as we kept talking about it, there were more situations. And I think some people looked at it and they're like, wait a second. Like, was that consensual? Like, and just we all need to re-examine what consent means to us, what consent looks like. And that way we can just all be more comfortable.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a very common reaction, and can be sometimes a trauma response where somebody might not realize what has happened to them until years later. And as we learn more, our perception of things that have happened, maybe something that you thought was consensual in the moment, maybe 5 years later you look back on that and you think, man, you know, that really wasn't consensual. That wasn't okay. And yeah, so as you learn, it's not uncommon that you kind of have these almost like revelations or like light bulb moments where you're like, yeah, me too, you know? And then kind of just to like bring it back and kind of flip it onto the positive side, I just do want to say that there are positive representations of this in the media as well. There's the show Sex Education, appropriately titled, on Netflix.
Love that show.
Yeah,
one of my favorites.
Yeah, that is an excellent representation. I will say it is, I don't know if it has a rating because it's on Netflix, but if you're under the age of 17, you know, get your parents' permission, all of that, because it can be pretty explicit. But it's very honest. It shows really good representation, how to navigate these conversations. It also has really realistic portrayals of assault. So I will say trigger warning for this show. But then it shows trauma in a really real way. I think it's really positive representation. Also, the show Pose, which that show is on FX, and I know that is rated mature, so, you know, viewers' discretion advised. Again, trigger warning. But that does a really good job, I think, of showing sex between all different kinds of people who are not just thin-bodied, white, cisgender, and heterosexual. It shows sex between all kinds of people. It shows people navigating these conversations, and really shows consent in a positive way.
And there's also a lot of HIV related stuff in there too.
Yes.
So
yeah, it's also just a really like historically accurate show.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. What are some other, you know, misconceptions that you hear?
Well, there's this idea that and we did talk about this already a little bit, but that consent can't be reversed. That once you hop into bed with someone, that is then an invitation or a yes to everything that could possibly happen in that bed. That's not true. It can be withdrawn at any time. And
no one is entitled to anybody else's body.
And it doesn't matter what kinds of things they say, like if they say something like, but, you know, you promised, or like, we're already this far, or like, come on. These are all excuse phrases. Excuses on the part of that person who's trying to pressure you, and you have no obligation to that person. You have a right to say no at any time, to stop at any time, and that person should be respecting that decision. It doesn't matter if you are completely, totally naked in bed with someone, you can say no still.
Yeah. I feel like I hear a lot about in my work about blue balls and like when you say like, oh, come on, we've already gone this far, like we can't stop now. Like, yes, somebody with a penis can have like a little bit of a reaction if they stop, but it's not something that is so painful that they will die if you stop. Like, it is okay. Don't let anyone guilt you into feeling that you have to do that or else it's going to cause them physical pain that they just can't deal with. That's just not the reality of the situation. That is people using manipulation. And that's not consent. So if you decide that you don't want to, and the other person saying it hurts their feelings or it hurts them physically, like that is just manipulation, that is coercion, and that's not consent. So
Exactly. Another misconception that I don't know if it's a misconception that's out there is the idea that a person can't be sexually assaulted by their partner or their spouse. This is completely false. And the reality is that marital rape, so somebody being assaulted by someone that they're married to, it just officially became illegal in all 50 states in 1993.
that's insane.
Yeah, that is not that long ago. I'm bad at math, so I can't really say how long ago it was.
28 this year, 20.
Sounds
Nope.
right. Probably 27, 28.
Less
I don't
than
know.
30. Less than 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Less than 30 years ago. That is absolutely insane.
It's that, like, when you are married in your vows, it's like, oh, I'm
It's
now
not like your vows are,
obligated.
yeah. It's not like by marrying someone you're then consenting to everything
No.
forever. That's not the way it
And
works.
that goes for both, men and women. Like, you're not entitled to somebody just because you're married or just because you're dating.
Exactly. And I think that sometimes is a misconception that people may have.
Yeah. So I know we talked about this a little bit already, but who needs to learn about consent and when do we start teaching that?
Well, this is a little bit of a trick question, I think, because, a question I had no part in coming up with as well. Everybody can and should learn about consent. Consent is something that is an ongoing conversation. Even us within SAFE, like this is something that we are always learning about ourselves. There's never it's not like it's a one and done thing. Like, all right, I took health class in high school and I had the SAFE person tell me what consent was and that's all I ever need to know about it. No, it's going to be an ongoing conversation. It's going to be a continuous process, and it's something that can start at a very young age. So I think that one of the this has become way more of a mainstream topic. I think about months like Let's Talk Month that I know Health Ed celebrates, for lack of a better word, in October, and that's about teaching parents how to talk to their kids. And I know that a huge there's been like this push for ways that we can, and when we talk about consent with kids, we're not saying sit your 6-year-old down and be like, this is how to sit. This conversation is going to look different at every age.
Yeah.
And a really, I think, easy way to introduce kids to consent is when Aunt Susie comes over, instead of saying, go give Aunt Susie a kiss, you might say, oh, there's Aunt Susie, do you want to give her a kiss? And if that child is like hanging back or is squirming or is like, oh, no, because they don't want Aunt Susie's red lipstick all over their face, that's okay. Give that child a choice. Say, oh, okay, what about a high five? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Don't like manipulate them and like put on like a guilt trip for them, which I'm not gonna lie, I used to do to my friends' kids. As far as like a hug, I would be like, oh, fine, you don't want to give me a hug, that's fine. Like, I guess I won't take you to ice cream today or whatever. Like, that's not okay. And like, I've recognized that behavior and been able to change it. So it is, consent is an ongoing thing for all of us, like you said.
It is. It's a constant reevaluation of ourselves and checking ourselves and learning as we go, because as values change in our society, we
have to grow.
The expectations change. Yeah, we do have to grow. I also saw, I know that this video was very viral on Facebook and stuff, I think a couple years ago now, but there was a teacher who, when the kids they would line up to go into her classroom, she would have one person be like the greeter, and then each child that came in, they would decide whether they wanted a fist bump, a hug, maybe like a high five, or I think there was also the option for nothing. Like you could just walk in. You didn't have to give the greeter anything. I thought that was really cool, and also just such a good idea of how we can implement this at a young age.
Yeah, because we all have different boundaries. You know, maybe you're feeling some type of way that day and you don't want to. It's definitely, that is a way of asking for consent. Like, how can I greet you today? What works for you? Yeah, exactly. I love that.
Yeah.
So to wrap up a little bit, what resources do you have? You know, how can people reach out to you guys? Or
really, I just want to reiterate the best way to get in contact with us is through that hotline number. There's a trained advocate on the other end of that line all hours of the day. If it's not something that we can directly help with, which 90% of the time it is, we can provide referrals out. So if you do have any questions, if anybody watches this, whether live or whether this does get posted, and if this brings up any feelings for you, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
And if you have questions, if you just want to know more information, it doesn't necessarily need to be that you are actively a survivor or victim of something. If you just have questions, if you just want to connect with us, please reach out.
Yeah. Same with health ed. I mean, if it is a situation where, you know, we need to refer someone to SAFE, we can definitely do that. But if someone just wants some education or some one-on-one or anything, any questions about it, we are happy to help all the time. So, well, thank you, Hannah, so much for joining me today. This was a really good conversation. So hopefully, you know, people were able to get something out of it.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that we were able to figure out our technical difficulties.
Yeah. Now we know for next time.
Exactly.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.